This video explores a specific and often overlooked prophecy within the biblical Book of Micah. We will examine two distinct visions presented by the prophet, one of impending judgment and one of future restoration. The central question we will address is how these ancient pronouncements are being interpreted by some in relation to the geopolitical and spiritual landscape surrounding Israel, particularly with an eye toward the year 2025 and beyond. The relevance of this 2,700-year-old text lies in its enduring influence on theological and political thought concerning the Middle East. Understanding the historical context and dual nature of Micah's message provides a more nuanced perspective on contemporary discussions about Israel's destiny. This is not about prediction, but about understanding a foundational text that continues to shape modern beliefs and interpretations, impacting how millions view world events. Throughout this analysis, we will cover the historical setting in which Micah prophesied, dissect the two core visions of judgment and hope, and explore how they have been understood through history. We will also touch upon why these themes of exile and return resonate so powerfully today. Our goal is to provide a clear, factual overview without making definitive claims about the future, focusing instead on textual and historical interpretation. My background involves years of dedicated study in biblical texts and their historical contexts, focusing on Hebrew prophetic literature. This exploration is the result of careful research into scholarly commentaries, historical records, and theological analyses to present a balanced and well-grounded perspective. The intention is to inform and encourage thoughtful consideration of the material, respecting the complexity of the subject matter and the intelligence of the viewer. To truly grasp the weight of Micah's words, one must first be transported back to his time, a period of immense political turmoil, social injustice, and religious decay. The northern kingdom of Israel was on the brink of collapse, and the southern kingdom of Judah was heading down a dangerous path. It was in this crucible of uncertainty that Micah received his visions, words spoken directly into a national crisis. The prophet Micah ministered in the 8th century BCE, a tumultuous era for the Hebrew kingdoms. He was a contemporary of the more famous prophet Isaiah, but his perspective was distinctly rural, hailing from Moresheth, a small town southwest of Jerusalem. This vantage point gave him a sharp eye for the corruption and oppression emanating from the urban elite in both Samaria, the capital of Israel, and Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. His ministry coincided with the reigns of kings Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah. This period was marked by the menacing expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which loomed as a dominant military power. The Assyrians systematically conquered neighboring nations, and their shadow fell heavily upon the region. This imminent external threat provides the stark backdrop for Micah's urgent warnings of divine judgment against his own people's internal failings. From a societal standpoint, Micah condemned widespread injustice. He spoke out fiercely against corrupt leaders, judges who accepted bribes, priests who taught for a price, and prophets who divined for money. He decried the powerful who seized land from the poor and the systemic greed that unraveled the fabric of their covenant community. His message was that social justice and true worship were intrinsically linked, and neglecting one invalidated the other. To understand his prophecy, it's helpful to think of the nation's covenant with God like a formal treaty. In the ancient Near East, such treaties had blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. Micah acted as a covenant enforcer, reminding the people that their actions, idolatry, injustice, and corruption were direct violations of their agreement. The impending Assyrian invasion was not merely a political event, but a consequence foretold within their own legal and spiritual framework. This dual crisis, an external military threat and an internal moral collapse, set the stage for the first of his two powerful visions. He saw not just the potential for disaster, but its inevitability. The judgment he foresaw was not random. It was a direct, targeted consequence of the choices being made in the halls of power and the city streets, a reaping of a bitter harvest they themselves had sown. Micah's first major vision is one of unsparing judgment. He opens his prophecy with a dramatic courtroom scene, calling the heavens and the earth to bear witness against the people of Israel and Judah. He declares that God is coming forth from his holy place to execute judgment. This is not a distant, abstract threat. Micah describes it with vivid, almost cinematic detail, as mountains melting like wax before a fire. The focus of this divine wrath is specifically directed at Samaria and Jerusalem, the political and religious centers of the two kingdoms. Micah portrays them as the epicenters of the national apostasy and social sin. He prophesies the total destruction of Samaria, which would be reduced to a heap of rubble in a field. This was a shocking and terrifying message, as Samaria was a fortified and prosperous city at the time. For Jerusalem, the capital of his own kingdom of Judah, the message was equally dire. Micah warned that the corruption of its leaders would lead to its downfall. In a famous and chilling passage, he states that Zion will be plowed as a field, Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins, and the Temple Mount a bare hill. This was a direct challenge to the popular belief that Jerusalem was inviolable because it housed God's temple. This vision of judgment is rooted in the concept of covenantal accountability. The people had broken their sacred pact with God through idolatry and, most significantly in Micah's view, through economic exploitation of the poor and vulnerable. The land itself was said to be polluted by their actions, and as a result, the people would be forcibly removed from it. This exile was presented as a direct and just consequence. The prophecy of destruction was not the end of the story, however. Even within these dire warnings of judgment and ruin, Micah planted the seeds of a profound paradox. The very mechanism of their punishment, the scattering and exile of the people, would become the unlikely precursor to an even more astonishing vision, one that looked beyond the ashes of Samaria and Jerusalem to an unimaginable future. Contrasting sharply with the vision of destruction, Micah's second vision unfolds as a powerful promise of restoration and hope. After detailing the impending doom, the prophetic lens shifts to a distant future. He speaks of a day when the remnant of Jacob will be gathered from the nations where they were scattered. This concept of a surviving remnant is crucial. It signifies that judgment, however complete, would not mean total annihilation for the people. Central to this vision is the restoration of Jerusalem to a place of global spiritual prominence. Micah 4 paints a picture of the last days, when the mountain of the Lord's house will be established as the highest of the mountains. Nations from all over the world are depicted streaming to it, seeking instruction in God's ways. This transforms Jerusalem from a site of judgment into a beacon of universal peace and divine law. The prophecy also contains one of the most famous messianic predictions in the Old Testament. In Micah 5:2, the prophet specifies that from the small, seemingly insignificant town of Bethlehem, Ephrathah, will come a ruler for Israel. This ruler's goings forth are from of old, from everlasting, suggesting a unique, preeminent status. He is depicted as a shepherd who will stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord. This future king would bring an era of unprecedented security and peace. Under his rule, the remnant of Israel would live securely, and his greatness would reach to the ends of the earth. This promise stood in stark opposition to the corrupt and ineffective kings of Micah's own time, offering a vision of ideal leadership rooted in divine authority and justice, a stark contrast to the impending Assyrian threat. The existence of these two opposing visions, one of total desolation and another of glorious restoration, creates a profound theological tension. How could both be true? How could a nation be utterly destroyed and yet rise to become a beacon to the world? This duality is not a contradiction, but a sophisticated prophetic structure that demands a deeper understanding of how such divine plans unfold across history. The tension between Micah's visions of judgment and restoration introduces a key principle in understanding Hebrew prophecy, the concept of dual or multiple fulfillments. This idea suggests that a single prophecy can have both a near-term, historical fulfillment and a long-term, future fulfillment. The prophecies are not necessarily a linear A then B timeline, but can operate on multiple levels simultaneously across different eras of history. In Micah's case, the prophecy of judgment against Samaria found its near-term fulfillment in 722 BCE, with the Assyrian conquest. The warning against Jerusalem was realized over a century later in 586 BCE with the Babylonian destruction and exile. These were concrete, verifiable historical events that validated the first part of his message for the generations that witnessed them. They confirmed his authority as a true prophet, speaking of impending tangible events. Simultaneously, the prophecies of restoration, the gathering of the remnant, and the rise of a ruler from Bethlehem were understood to point to a more distant future. The return from the Babylonian exile was seen by many as a partial, initial fulfillment of this promise. However, the grander, more utopian descriptions of global peace and a Messianic king suggested a fulfillment that transcended that single historical event, creating an ongoing expectation. This prophetic duality serves a critical theological purpose. It demonstrates that God's plans are not thwarted by human failure or historical catastrophe. Judgment is real and consequential, but it does not have the final word. Restoration and redemption are woven into the larger narrative, often emerging from the very ashes of judgment. This complex interplay of judgment and promise raises profound questions, which we encourage you to discuss respectfully in the comments below. Therefore, interpreting Micah's words requires holding these two visions in a delicate balance. One cannot be fully understood without the other. The severity of the judgment highlights the magnificence of the promised restoration. This structure forces the reader to look beyond immediate circumstances and consider a much larger, overarching historical and theological framework, a framework built on specific and powerful symbolic language. To fully appreciate Micah's message, we must examine the key symbols he employs. The most significant is the remnant. This doesn't refer to just any survivors, but a purified and faithful portion of the people who would endure the judgment of exile and become the seed for the nation's future. The remnant represents the enduring nature of God's covenant. Even when the majority goes astray, a core will be preserved for redemptive purposes. Another powerful symbol is the Tower of the Flock, or Migdal Eder, mentioned in Micah 4:8. This was an actual location just outside of Bethlehem, known as a place where shepherds watched over lambs destined for temple sacrifice. By applying this name to the stronghold of Zion, Micah connects Jerusalem's future glory with the pastoral sacrificial system and, significantly, with the region of Bethlehem, subtly reinforcing the origin of the future ruler. The town of Bethlehem itself is a symbol of immense importance. In Micah's time, it was a minor, unassuming village. Its selection as the birthplace of the future king is a deliberate expression of a recurring biblical theme: God choosing the humble and insignificant to accomplish his great purposes. This stands in direct contrast to the human tendency to look for power and prominence in great cities like Jerusalem or Samaria. The imagery of the ruler as a shepherd is also deeply symbolic. In the ancient Near East, kings were often called shepherds of their people. However, Micah's shepherd king is different. He rules not by force or political maneuvering, but with the strength and majesty of God himself. He provides security, nourishment, and peace for his flock, embodying the ideal of righteous and benevolent leadership that the kings of Micah's day had so utterly failed to achieve. These symbols are not mere poetic flourishes. They are load-bearing pillars of the prophecy. They connect Micah's message to broader biblical themes of covenant, sacrifice, and messianic hope. Understanding this symbolic language is essential before we can properly analyze how these visions were seen to be fulfilled in the historical record, both in the ancient world and in subsequent interpretations that followed centuries later. The first part of Micah's prophecy, the vision of judgment, did not remain an abstract warning for long. Its fulfillment began within a generation. The northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital at Samaria, was conquered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire around 722 BCE. Historical records, including Assyrian annals like the Annals of Sargon II, confirm the siege, conquest, and subsequent deportation of a significant portion of the Israelite population, validating Micah's specific warning. Archaeological evidence further supports the biblical account of Samaria's destruction. Excavations at the site have revealed layers of destruction corresponding to the Assyrian period, showing the city was indeed overthrown and resettled by foreign peoples, as was Assyrian policy. For the people of Judah, this event was a terrifying confirmation of Micah's prophetic authority and a stark warning of what could happen to them if they did not change course. Over a century later, the vision of judgment for Jerusalem also came to pass. After a series of rebellions against the new regional power, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar II laid siege to Jerusalem. In 586 BCE, the city fell. The Babylonians, as Micah had foretold, destroyed the city, including the revered Temple of Solomon. The elite and many citizens were carried off into exile in Babylon. This event was a cataclysmic trauma for the Judean people, a crisis that fundamentally reshaped their theology and identity. It confirmed that even God's holy city and temple were not immune to judgment when the covenant was broken. The words of Micah, once a dire warning, were now read as a painful but accurate historical explanation for their national tragedy, proving the prophet's message was grounded in historical reality. The fulfillment of this first terrible vision set the stage for the second. With the people scattered and the holy city in ruins, the promises of restoration and a ruler from Bethlehem seemed more distant than ever. Yet, the very accuracy of the prophecy of judgment lent a new and desperate weight to the prophecy of hope. If the warnings had come true, perhaps the promises of a return would too. Following the historical fulfillment of Micah's warnings of judgment, the focus of interpretation naturally shifted to his vision of hope. The return from Babylonian exile under the Persian king Cyrus the Great was seen as a partial realization of this hope. A remnant did return to rebuild the temple and the city. However, the restoration fell short of the glorious Messianic era of global peace and divine rule that Micah had described so vividly. This led to a growing expectation for a more complete future fulfillment, particularly centered on the promised ruler from Bethlehem. Within Jewish thought of the Second Temple period, Messianic expectation intensified. Micah 5:2 became a key proof text, identifying the specific birthplace of the anticipated Messiah, the anointed king from the line of David, who would restore Israel's fortunes and establish justice on the earth. This interpretation is most famously crystallized in the New Testament. The Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 2, explicitly quotes Micah 5:2 to explain why the Magi were directed to Bethlehem in their search for the newborn King of the Jews. The early Christian writers saw the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem as the direct and literal fulfillment of Micah's ancient prophecy, identifying Jesus as the promised shepherd king. For Christian theology, this interpretation became foundational. It connected Jesus to the long line of Old Testament prophecies, affirming his identity as the awaited Messiah. The description of the ruler whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting, was also interpreted as pointing to Jesus' divine nature. Thus, Micah's words were seen not just as a prediction of a place, but of a specific divine person. This messianic reading, however, does not negate the prophecy's relevance to the nation of Israel. Instead, it creates a new layer of theological dialogue. The dual visions of judgment and restoration, land and leadership, continue to be central to both Jewish and Christian understanding of God's relationship with Israel. This brings us to the complex question of how these ancient themes are being applied in our modern world. When we bring Micah's prophecy into the 21st century, its themes of judgment and restoration take on new layers of meaning for modern interpreters. The re-establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 is viewed by many, particularly within certain Christian and Jewish traditions, as a momentous fulfillment of prophecies about the gathering of the exiled remnant back to the ancient homeland. This event has renewed focus on prophetic texts, including Micah. The ongoing geopolitical conflicts and internal societal divisions within modern Israel are sometimes viewed through the lens of Micah's warnings. His condemnations of injustice and corrupt leadership, and his insistence on covenant faithfulness, are seen by some commentators as timeless principles that remain relevant. They argue that the nation's security is intrinsically linked to its moral and spiritual health, echoing the prophet's original message. This is an interpretation, not a new prophecy. The 2025 lens is less about a specific date and more about a contemporary mindset that sees ancient prophecies as actively unfolding in current events. For those who hold this view, the dual visions of Micah provide a framework for understanding Israel's present and future. They see the nation existing in the same prophetic tension, a state of partial restoration, yet still facing significant threats and falling short of the ultimate messianic peace Micah described. It is crucial to state that this is a specific theological interpretation and not a universally accepted political or historical analysis. Scholars and theologians disagree on how, or even if, these ancient texts should be directly applied to modern nation-states. Our purpose here is not to endorse a single viewpoint, but to explain how the prophecy is being actively used in contemporary discourse to make sense of a complex reality. Disclaimer: this analysis explores theological interpretations and is not a political